instead.
We apologise for this improvised slate. The date is October 29th, 1995. The survivor is Hannah Buchman, Hannah Nash, Nash. The city is Sydney, Region 6, Australia. Interviewer Kathleen Turner, Kathleen and the language spoken is English.
Rolling in set.
My name is Kathleen Turner and I'm interviewing Mrs. Hannah Buchman Nash. The date is October the 29th, 1995. We are here in Sydney, Australia, and the language being spoken is English.
Cameras rolling and set.
Hello, Hannah, and welcome on behalf of the Shoah Foundation. Thank you for spending time with us. Perhaps you'd like to start by just telling us your name.
My name is Hannah Nash.
And your birth date.
3rd of July 1922.
And your age now is?
73.
Where were you born, Hannah?
I was born in Warsaw, Poland.
Were you born at home or in a hospital?
At home. Yes, the doctor came to the home and my mother had us both, me and my brother, at home. It wasn't fashionable then to go to hospital.
So did you continue living in that same house?
Yes, till we moved to Radom. That was a different town. We moved there in 1934, I think. And then we moved to another flat in Radom.
When you were living in Warsaw, were you in an apartment or a house?
Apartment. In Poland, people in cities mainly lived in apartments, not in houses like in Australia.
And who was living with you in that apartment?
My father, my mother, a domestic cook, and a governess for us.
So how old was your brother?
My brother is a year and a half younger than me. About 15 months difference between us.
So can you remember back to when you were a small child?
Vaguely. Really vaguely. I remember the apartment in Warsaw. I remember odd things. My brother seems to remember much better than I do this period in our life. He remembers things like what things cost, and I have no idea. Yes.
What was your lifestyle like? Would you say you were a middle-class family, or?
Yes, we were. Yeah. We were well off. We have a very nice apartment in a very good street, and we went to a private schools. I think we were pretty well off.
What was the name of the street you lived in?
In Warsaw, the name was Emilia Pleter. Would you want me to spell it? No, because that was a heroine, Polish heroine. The street was named after her. And we lived on the 4th floor, and there was a lift there, which was not usual in Warsaw, in the buildings. And I went to Poland in '65, I think, and I wanted to see the place we used to live. But that place used to have 6 floors, and we lived on the 4th floor. But when I went to see it, there were only 2 floors left. So that has been bombed during the war.
So you and your brother and your parents, and did you have cousins or grandparents close by?
Yes, the grandparents lived not, my mother's parents. My father's parents I don't remember, because his mother died before I was born, and his father died when I was a small child. He had, we weren't very close to my father's family. We were much closer to my mother's family, who had a brother and a sister, and we were in touch with them.
And did you have cousins?
Yes, well, my aunt had one boy who was younger than us, and my uncle, at the time when we lived in Warsaw, didn't have any children yet.
So, would you
We were
say
a pretty small family.
you were close knit?
Yes,
Yeah.
we were.
Did you celebrate special days and Jewish holidays together?
Well,
like that?
mainly at my grandparents' place. We didn't do it much ourselves, but we always went for all the holidays to their place. But we were not very religious people.
So, did you belong to a larger Jewish community?
Yes, we did. Mainly our friends were Jewish. You know, in Poland, Jews more or less kept a bit separate. You know, we were not really accepted. In our circle, it wasn't too bad, but in lower classes, it was very difficult. People didn't mix much.
You think that they more or less stayed together and lived in closer
Yes.
communities?
Yes, and they were not really accepted by Polish people as equals socially.
Was there a synagogue nearby?
Well, there were, I think, several synagogues in Warsaw. I don't remember ever being in one, but I know there were.
Did your brother take his bar mitzvah?
Yes, but it was later. It was when we lived in Radom. And it took place in our home. A rabbi came to our home, and my grandparents came from Warsaw then, and we had a lot of people at our home in Radom. But it wasn't in a synagogue. It was not long before the war when he had his bar mitzvah.
What would you like to just describe your lifestyle as a small child in Poland at that time?
Well, it was a pleasant life. We had a very nice home. We had friends. We went to the kindergarten. We went on holidays regularly. We had a comfortable life, and we had a happy home.
What was your father's profession?
My father owned a tannery, a factory where he, prepared leather to be used as, for other purpose. And he had, for a long time, his father owned this tannery, and afterwards he inherited it, him and his brother. And after a few years, it wasn't discussed much, but I understood that things weren't working out very well between them, and he decided to make some arrangement, and he bought this tannery in Radom. For a while we lived in Warsaw, and he used to stay there and come for weekends. My mother wasn't keen to move to a provincial town, but after a while it got really too difficult for him, this traveling, and it wasn't very far, but still it was, the whole week he didn't have a home. He lived on premises near the factory. So we moved, I think it was in 1934, to Radom, which was rather traumatic for me, because the change of school and losing my friends, and it was a different way of life in a small town to Warsaw.
How old were you at that time, Hannah?
I was about 12.
So you'd finished primary school?
Yes, I went to high school in Radom, and I was a bit lost. The first year I didn't do well because it seemed to be a completely different course to what I have been used in Warsaw, and I felt lonely and quite unhappy, I remember. Then I made friends with other young people and adjusted slowly to a different way of life.
Can you remember anything about your days in your primary school?
What do you mean, days? We were taken usually to school by our governess and picked up, and we used often to visit other children, and they came to visit us, and we used to go to a park to play after finishing school. We had a very pleasant life, especially in Warsaw. It seemed much nicer than in Radom.
So what language did you speak at that time, Hannah?
Yes, we had at that time, we had this French girl that we mostly spoke with her in French, and we were quite fluent in it. And we spoke Polish at home. I think my father in his business spoke Yiddish to other people. I could hear him speak, but we didn't speak it at home.
And at school?
At school we spoke Polish, and we learned French. You could choose French or German. I chose French. And I was very fond of Latin. Somehow I was one of the few kids that really enjoyed Latin, and now looking back I think that was the most useful thing I ever learned, Latin, because it made it easier for me to learn other languages afterwards, and I just felt interested in that.
Was your primary school public school or a Jewish school, private school?
It was a private school. I don't think it was particularly Jewish. You know, it was a mixture of children. It wasn't only Jewish, but it was private school.
And you had happy days there, did you, in that school?
Yes, I was very happy.
And then you moved to Radom?
Yes, at first I was quite unhappy in Radom, but I adjusted slowly. I liked reading. I really more or less became self-sufficient. I didn't mix much, and I didn't make friends quickly, so I remember it was a difficult time in my life.
Can you remember the name of the school, Hannah?
Yes, Maria Gail, I wrote it down. That was in Radom. And Poland I can't remember. In Warsaw I can't remember exactly the name of the school, the primary school, but that one I remember.
So
it was a Polish school. There were only 3 Jewish girls in my class. One of them is still here, and we are still friends. Yes.
So you didn't find school difficult?
No, after the first year, I found when I moved to Radom difficult because the course seemed to be completely different. It was hard for me to use what I knew, and I was expected to know things I wasn't taught, so I was a bit confused. But afterwards I did well at school. I was good at languages, particularly at history, more humanities. I wasn't very brilliant in math, I remember, or science, but with languages I was good.
Did you find there was any discrimination between yourself and the other 2 Jewish girls while you were at school?
Not at my school, because you know, there weren't enough of us really to be a problem to anybody. But my brother went to a public school, and he felt it very much.
What sort of problems did he have?
Well, he wasn't accepted socially, and There were always a few who were friendly, but mostly he felt he was treated as an inferior person. I had it much easier in my school than he did.
How long were you in that school for, Hannah?
Till the war broke out. I was going to do my final year at school in '39.
Before war actually broke out, did you sense that there was a change in the political climate in
Of course,
Poland?
we knew what was happening everywhere. We knew what was happening in Germany.
How did you know that?
Oh, look, we had radio, we had papers, we knew what was happening, and my parents traveled quite a lot. You know, my father used to go on business. He went to Vienna just before the Anschluss, before the Germans walked in. I remember he came quite panic-stricken back. He said, this dreadful thing was happening in Europe. We knew that. That's why we were so frightened when Germans started, you know, the war.
Can you remember when that fear first started to creep into your life, roughly?
Well, it was a long time since Hitler came to power in Germany. I could hear always conversation about that.
What year was that, Hannah?
That would be, 34, 35.
And following that?
Well, we knew what was happening in Germany. In 1938, Germany, throughout all the Jewish people who were not actually born in Germany or German subjects, and they put them on the Polish frontier. And we had at our place a little boy whose father was imprisoned, and his mother and 3 children were thrown out of their home. And so we had this little boy at our place staying with us.
Were there any other refugees coming into your town?
Yes, most Jewish families took some people to their home to help them out.
So where were they mainly coming from?
Germany. I can't remember what towns, different places, but I couldn't recall which one. Ours, I think, lived in Berlin. I think they lived. His father was a lawyer, and they was still, thrown out.
So how long did you accommodate that family?
Till the war broke out. Then we left home ourselves. I don't know what happened to them after that.
So you had them with you several years, did you?
No, it was only just over a year, because then in September '39 the war broke out and we went away.
When war broke out in '39, that stopped your schooling, did it?
Of course. It was our first day of school when the war started. 1st of September school started, and it was already, we were being bombed that day.
Can you remember how you felt?
Oh yes, I remember it well. It was very frightening. It was very intensive bombing, and it was terrible.
Did you have somewhere to go when the bombs started to fall?
No, we didn't have any shelter or anything, we were not prepared for that. And then my father, he had a truck in the factory, and he said, the Germans are approaching, let's go away. And we packed a few things, and we got into the truck, and we had a driver, and we were driving east. And we were stopping at some small towns to get some food, and we were, and there was terrible bombing everywhere.
How many of you were in the truck, Anna?
Just the four of us, and the driver. That was all. Just the four of us.
So what happened to the rest of your family, your grandparents and aunts and cousins?
Well, they were in Warsaw, and we were in Radom. That was different. My grandparents, actually, we didn't know that then, were killed in the first week of war by a bomb. The bomb in their own... No, they had a shelter, and they went to a shelter, and they got killed in the shelter. Bomb shelter.
And your cousin and aunts?
Aunt and cousin survived the bombing, but they were killed by Germans afterwards in a concentration camp. All the family. No one. My mother's brother, he survived. I don't know how, but he did. He died since, but he did survive.
How did you know about your family going to the concentration camps?
Oh, we found out afterwards. We didn't know it at the time because, you see, when we left home, we traveled and we got as far as I showed you the town Białystok. It took us about 3 weeks traveling in the truck to get to Białystok. And I don't remember what happened to the truck. I think that we couldn't get petrol, we abandoned it. And in Białystok, my mother remembered that her parents had friends who lived there. And we went there and they were wonderful. They took us in. They had a big flat and they said, look, my grandparents were good to them in the previous war, you know, so they were. And we stayed with them till we were, Russians came and sent us to the labor camp.
So what was it like at Białystok when you drove in?
Well, it was very unsettled existence. I went to, they started a Russian school there. I couldn't speak much Russian then. I learned since, but then I couldn't. I hated the school and it was completely different system and I wasn't very happy. And then I revolted. I said, I am not going to this school anymore. I don't understand anyway what they do. And then we just didn't know what is going to happen. And my father decided he wants to, he had, a letter from some friends in Poland. He said he wanted to go back and see what's happening, because we didn't know what happened and we left everything. And he said, I'll go see, maybe I can save something and I'll come back, he said.
What year was this, Hannah?
Pardon?
What year was this?
That was still 39. Yes. September, yes, it was winter, 39. No, we were in Białystok about 8 months. Oh no, it was later, it was already 1940. And he went and we get news from him and he said that he's trying to arrange something so that he can get some money that was owed to him and things like that, and that he will come and join us. He never did. And afterwards we heard that he was imprisoned and he died. And he died, I know, at home, because there was a funeral, we are told, that people went to his funeral. But we don't know exactly what happened.
So his brother was still in Warsaw, was he?
Well, I never heard. His nephew joined us when we were in Białystok. He came and by himself, his family. Well, his father died before the war. His father had cancer and died before the war. And he had 2 sisters who stayed at home with their mother. And he came and he was by himself and he said, can he stay with us? He was a bit older than me, Henry. And he stayed with us the whole war. We went to Russia together, and then he went to the army with my brother. I showed you the photo. And afterwards he went to America. He found some relatives of his mother in America, and they had a daughter, and he started corresponding with the daughter, and they decided to have a marriage by proxy. And it was at the end of the war, and they were in England then. He was with my brother. They were still in the army, but my brother was doing matriculation, and he went to university, and Henry was unsettled, didn't know what to do with himself. So this girl came and they got married, and he went to America.
How old was your brother when you were in Bialystok?
Bialystok, he was 15.
So did he go to school there too?
Yes, he went to school too. He didn't like it either, but he was younger and he had to go.
How did you receive news about your father?
Well, we didn't, because we had news from my father. We had, even when we were deported to Russia, we had letter and parcel from him. He was still alive then. And then we didn't know, we stopped getting any news from him. We didn't know what happened. In Russia, we didn't get any news. Only when we came to Iran, we started hearing things, that dreadful things were happening in Poland. The camps and the death camps and the things. We didn't know anything in Russia what was happening.
So back in Bialystok, there was just who? Who were you with?
My mother, my brother, and Henry joined us. We were, and then we heard that Russians are going to deport the, people who came from, who ran away from. Actually, Germany and Russia divided Poland in half. That they had the agreement before the war, because they tried to delay the war, the Russians especially, so they decided to divide Poland, and Russia occupied, Bialystok belonged to Russians, and the other, the western part of Poland was occupied by the Germans. In Bialystok we were in the Russian part of Poland, and the people, the refugees who came from different parts, we had news that they are going to be deported into Russia for forced labor, and we were very frightened of that. And when we heard that they start coming and putting people into the trains to Siberia and to this, we hid in a, in a kind of garage or whatever. But we were found and they deported us.
So were there Russian military personnel around in Bialystok?
Yes, yes.
And that's why you found school so difficult?
Yes. It was all in Russian, It was,
We'll just break for a tape now.
yes.
Tape 2, interview with Helen Nash. Helen, you were just telling me about Bialystok,
Yes,
where you were with your mother and your brother
yes,
and a cousin,
yes.
and you had fears that you were going to be deported. Could you tell us about that, why you felt that way?
Well, there were a lot of refugees there, and we met other people, and the news were spreading very fast about things. They said if you didn't have evidence that you were a resident of Bialystok, you were considered a refugee, and Russians, what they really wanted was free labor. Here there were big groups of people who were really in the middle of nowhere, and they felt if they take them into Russia and use them as very cheap labor, that will help their war effort. They weren't at war yet, but they knew they will be. You see, because that was just delaying tactics, this agreement they had, this peace agreement, that was a terrible shock to the whole world, how such mortal enemies like Russia and Germany reached an agreement, but Russia was panicky, you know, they were afraid, they were not prepared to fight yet. And, you know, there were people who heard about it, what's happening. And see, there were people, some people who were communists in Poland, and they thought they were important, and they tried to get jobs with Russians, and you know, and from them, if they knew things, things spread, and we knew that probably will happen. And if we had that others in the other houses not far away, they took people and put them on the train, we were afraid it was going to happen to us, and it did. And in the long run, we were very lucky it happened to us, because the people we stayed in Bialystok, after Germans came, when the Russians, you know, retreated, no one survived. They had those concentration camps very close there, and they killed everybody.
So the people who were being deported, was there a form of selection?
Well, if you were not a local resident of in this part of Poland that was occupied by Russians, you came from the other, they felt you were refugees and they deported you.
And what about the children?
Everybody, families with children, everybody. We were put into cattle trains, which, you know, it was terrible, the hygiene and everything.
Who came to get you, Hannah?
Russian soldiers.
They came into the house?
Yes, they came and they searched the house. They found us in a cellar where we were, and they took us to the station and put us on the train.
What did you have with you?
Well, they told us we could take a few essentials. We didn't have that much with us anyway, because when we left home we had a few things, but not that much, and they gave us time to collect our possessions. They took us, they knew where we lived, you know, they said, look, go upstairs, we'll take you to the flat, take your things, you are going away. And we did, we took a few things, and we went and we traveled by this train about 3 weeks.
How did they know that you were a refugee from another part of Poland?
They knew because we had to register. You know, the people who lived there, they were getting certificates that they are residents of this town, and those who didn't, you know, we had to register that we are refugees. And they had lists of people, and they knew.
So you went, they took you to the station on foot or in a truck?
Trucks. So they came with trucks and took us to the station and loaded us on those trains. Took a couple of days till we left, you know, till this train was fully loaded.
How long were you waiting on the station?
A couple of days. It was, we were already in the train. You know.
Was it a normal passenger train?
No, it was a cattle, you know, where you transport animals, this kind of train. And it was very primitive, you know. You slept on the floor. They had like shelves. They put shelves so you could sleep one on top of the other on shelves.
How many people would have been in each truck?
A lot. We were very crowded. They gave us water, they gave us some basic, but very little food. And we stopped sometimes at a station for a long time, and they let us out, just for hygiene, for the reason. And we were watched all the time. So anyway, no one felt they could escape because we didn't even know where we were.
When you first went into the truck, was it all Polish people that were being transported with you?
Yes.
Not just Jewish Poles?
No, there was a mixture.
And children were in that transport
yes,
too?
Children, old people, anybody.
So what was actually in the truck that you were able to live there for several weeks?
We were not in a truck, we were on a train. Well, they brought us water, they brought us bread, dry bread, and they let us out a few times a day under guard, and that was all. And we were traveling and we were sleeping there. And
did anybody get sick?
oh yes, a lot of people got sick, and they were hungry, and there were all elderly people who got sick.
And what were the sanitary arrangements in the camp?
They let us out when otherwise they had buckets.
There was no running water?
On a train.
So who were the guards?
Soldiers, Russian soldiers, yes. And it took us about 3 weeks to get to this place, Kotlas, where I showed you, and there we waited under guard, and we were taken by trucks to the forest.
So
we went by boat somewhere. I can't remember exactly how far we went by boat. And then there were no more trucks because it was in the forest. They had horses and things like that to put our things on.
So do you know how far the cattle truck went? How many kilometers or miles that was?
Oh, that was a long way. I'll show you on the map, from Białystok to Kotlas.
Białystok in Poland, right?
Yes.
Across Poland.
Yes, across. Well, Białystok wasn't very far from the Russian frontier, but then we went half the Russia. We went by this train.
And that took how long to get?
About 3 weeks.
3 weeks. So you virtually lived in the cattle trucks for the 3 weeks.
Yes.
Do you remember the names of any of the stations where you were allowed to stop?
No, I can't remember. I couldn't even read in Russian then. If they were written, but I didn't know the Russian alphabet. They have different alphabet too. And none of us knew any Russian.
So if anybody became ill, was there any medical attention for you?
No, there were no doctors or medical attention. No.
So you were just allowed out, and then you had to get back in.
Oh yes, because the guard was there, and he counted us, and we had to go in. And anyway, no one really, had any idea where we were and where could anybody go. They couldn't speak usually the language or anything. That is not far you could get away.
Was anybody taken off at any of the stops?
So if someone was very sick or they took him off, I don't know what happened to them, but they took them off the train if it was obvious that the person couldn't go any further.
With so many of you in such a small space for such a long period of time, Hannah, what was the relationship like between all of you?
Of course,
that
some people were pushy. They wanted more space that they were given. You really get to know human nature under those circumstances. But mostly, after a while, people, we didn't eat much. We were tired. We were weak, and it was summer. It was quite hot. There was hardly any air in that train. So. It was, people weren't very energetic. It was just apathy. They were sitting and no one knew what was going to happen to us.
Did you find that people supported other people within families? Or?
Yes, a lot, a lot. I found that basically, people are decent. Of course, there are a lot of exceptions to that, but in different circumstances, a lot of people will share, will help other people. I have great confidence in human nature.
Did any of you know what was happening or where you were going to go?
No, we didn't know where we knew that they would put us in some camp, some labor camp, but we didn't know where we were going and what we were expecting exactly to do. When we got there were barracks. We lived in a barrack, about 20 people. There were no beds, we slept on the floor.
Where was this, Hannah?
That was, halfway between Kotlas and Archangel.
So you got to Kotlas, and that was a sort of transit camp, was it?
Transit point, yes. It wasn't really a camp. We were really on a railway station there, waiting for them to organize who is going where.
Yes.
And then we went by boat for a while. I can't remember how far we went by boat. Then we went a little in a trucks. And then when there was no more road, they had horse and cart, to put a bit of luggage or people who really were not capable of walking.
Were you still together as a family?
Yes, we were together. They didn't really separate us, because it wasn't that kind of camp. It was a labor camp, but, so there were some camps that they separated men and women, but that wasn't. That was mainly they put us to work, all they wanted from us was free labor.
So children were included in that journey
yes,
as well?
Yes.
And even small babies?
Even small babies. But in this respect, at least people were not separated, not like it happened in Germany. See, I kept comparing afterwards. I thought we were pretty lucky to get there, not in a German concentration camp. And there wasn't this cruelty that the Germans had. Nobody had anything to eat. Even our guards didn't get any more to eat than we did. The piece of bread and some watery soup once a day. But, we were not really persecuted. I remember an incident that at some stage, we were cutting trees in a forest. Actually, the women mostly, they used men to cut the trees. We were just cutting the already fallen trees into pieces. That was mostly women's job. And I noticed that one of the guards who guarded us used to take me away from a group that was working, and that worried me. I went to the camp commandant, Russian. By then I could make myself understood in Russian. And I said to him, look, I don't mind the work or anything, but I wish he wouldn't take me away from other people. The next day the guard wasn't there anymore. So it wasn't that abject cruelty that the Germans had.
How long did it take you to get from the transit, the sorting station, Cutler, to your camp?
Oh, about a couple of days.
So do you know the name of the camp?
Yes. His name was Tikhonino. Tikhonino. That's a Russian word. I put it somewhere on a...
So where was
it was the name of it wasn't a town or anything. It was the name of the camp.
So what was the nearest town?
Nearest town, a small village. Nearest was about 10 kilometers or 15 kilometers. I'm not sure. It was quite a long way because we got occasional mail. The men came from this village once a week with a mail. And once I had a terrible toothache. And it was really, I was so swollen. So the commandant said that I can go with the man who brought post to this village, that once a month, I think, a dentist comes there. So he knew when the dentist was coming. So I walked this 15 it took us almost 5 or 6 hours to walk there. And I went to the dentist. It was a young woman, and she looked pretty young to me to be a dentist. I said, "Are you a dentist?" She said, "Yes, but we had a shortened course during the war of dentist." Anyway, she took out at first the wrong tooth without anesthetic. It was quite a job with that. Finally, she took the right tooth. I fainted. I was lucky. It was terrible. Without any anesthetic, without anything, and she didn't know how to do it.
What was the nearest large city to the camp, Hannah?
Archangel. But I don't know, we never went near it there.
So that's
It was quite a long way.
northern Russia.
Yes, it was, you know, we had, in summer there was hardly any night, but summer was very short, and in winter it was dark most of the time.
So what sort of working conditions, how many hours a day did you have to work?
We worked, even when it was dark and they had lanterns and things, we worked about 10 hours a day. If the temperature went under 30 degrees, you know, we were allowed not to go to work.
So can you describe the actual barracks where you lived?
Yes, after a while they gave us, wouldn't call it a bed, but it was like a platform, you know, wooden platform, and if you put a blanket or something, you slept on that, because otherwise there were bugs and cockroaches and things there. So we had one big stove there. There's plenty of wood. There's no shortage of wood. There were forests all around us. And so we always had this oven going, and we could boil water in it. But if you wanted to wash yourself, you had to go to the river and cut the ice. And I used to ask my brother to help me to get the water to wash. He said, "But you washed only a week ago. You don't need to wash that often."
What was the name of that river?
Can you remember? It was small river. It wasn't much, but it was the only water we could get to.
Were you still together as a family?
Yes.
In the barracks?
In
there?
the barracks.
Yes. And what was the food like?
Well, we had a ration of black bread. They were not very big, you know. No, the black bread was very heavy, you know. So if you got, it was a couple of slices by the time you reached the weight required. And in the evening they were giving us soup made of cabbage or very watery thing. But in summer it was better because we could collect mushrooms and berries in the wood. That sometimes we would steal potatoes, you know, when you could find, because there were some Russian farmers not very far away, and there was a kolkhoz where they had things, but if they caught you stealing potatoes, you were in trouble.
Did anybody try to escape from the camp?
No, because, look, people could hardly speak the language. They couldn't read the signs. Where could you go? It's such a huge... Where could you run away?
Were there any other nationalities in the camp with you?
Not many people from Poland. Not in our camp. because, you know, in Bialystok, the refugees came from different parts of Poland, and there were no others. There were some Jewish people, some non-Jewish people, but we were all from Poland.
Did you have any news of your father while you were there?
Yes, we had a couple of letters, and we had even a parcel he sent, and it was amazing that the parcel arrived. It was very good. He sent us jumpers and things, and then it stopped, and we didn't know what happened.
So how long were you, as a family, how long were you in the camp?
Till the war broke out between Germany and Russia, and Germany invaded Russia, and they made an agreement that they would create a Polish army in Russia, because there were a lot of Polish prisoners of war Russians took during when they first got into Poland, when they divided it. Actually, my husband, whom I didn't know then, he was a doctor. He just finished then, you know, and he was in the Polish army, and he was taken prisoner of war, and he was sent to a camp of prisoners. He was even sent to a camp. There were only officers, not soldiers, but there were separate camps. And then, as he told us a story, they started sending groups of people. They were told they are going back to Poland. So people wanted to go. They didn't know what was happening in the German occupied Poland. They wanted to go to their families, and they were very happy to go.
Were these people from the camp, were they?
Yes. There were groups going, and they were picked at random. No one knew why certain group of people were going. And when my husband finally, he was the last group that was taken from this camp, and when he was going in a train, there was written messages. We are going here, we are stopping at that station, there. And so that was the same trains that the others went. And he didn't know what happened to the other people. But by the time he was going to this destination, Germans were already close to where it happened, and they turned them back. They didn't go. They turned them back into Russia. And afterwards, you know, he found out they killed, I think, 6,000 Polish officers in Katyn massacre. You know, everyone knew that. Russians said that Germans did it when they approached the camp where the officers were. But my husband was convinced, and afterwards everybody was convinced, that Russians did that because they were afraid that Polish officers would create an army and turn against Russia with the Germans. That must have been their reason. Why else would they take thousands of Polish officers and they just shot them into mass grave?
Did your husband was a witness to that, was he?
He wasn't a witness to that because fortunately he was too late getting there to be shot, because Germans were approaching quickly and they didn't want to go any further, the Russians.
So he avoided that?
They turned him back. It was not his decision. He didn't know where he was going. But afterwards, they found out when they started making a Polish army, the Polish people said, well, where are the officers that were prisoners of war? At first, Russians said they are somewhere where it's frozen, they can't be returned at the moment. And they started, you know, told those stories. Afterwards, they said that the Germans did that when they found the graves of these people. But there was evidence that the Russians did it as Germans were approaching. They did that. So my husband was very lucky. He said he lived on borrowed time because most of the people, because he was in the last transport, he survived.
So were there transports from your your camp back into
When we
Poland?
were, you see, when this war broke out, Russia had an agreement with England because they needed help then with the Germans, you know, the fighting. And they allowed a Polish army to be created in Uzbekistan it was. So they put us again into these trains, these cattle trains, but this time we were not under guard anymore. We were free, but we didn't get hardly anything, any food.
How long did it take to go from
Also,
back
it was a long way. I will show you on the map from where we were to Uzbekistan. It was took us a long time, about also 3 weeks or more. And I remember the train stopped in a place in Samarkand. It was a big town. So my brother and another fellow said, look, we will go and see, maybe we'll get some food or something, you know, you could trade in. If you had a few things, we used to trade clothes or whatever we had to get food, because we were starving in the train. And but we had an agreement that if something happens, we get off at the next station, because once you lost someone in Russia, you could never find them. So that happened. Those two, my brother and another fellow went, and after a little while the train started moving and we left the station. We were terribly upset. But we traveled for some hours, and then it stopped at another little station. So we got off, the family of this person who went, and us, we sat at the station for 2 nights, and finally they came. On another train they got.
So you were reunited?
We were reunited, and we went to this place where we were told that the Polish army was being formed. And we thought that, you know, the boys would go to the army and we would be evacuated.
So what year or month, can you remember the month that you left the camp together, the barracks? What was the weather like?
It was spring. I think it was spring, because it was such a shock to our system. Going from this spring where we were, it wasn't very warm, but when we got to Uzbekistan, it was very hot. And the problem was that people were getting terribly sick. There was typhoid. A lot of people died, you know, because of sickness.
Did many die in the barracks when you were actually in the barracks?
In the barracks, oh yes, quite a few people there.
Because of the living conditions? Or?
Living conditions, some people were not so young, you know, and there were accidents with this falling trees.
Did everybody have to work in that barracks?
Yes, everybody had to work. And my mother, well, she wasn't old. She pretended to be old. She was trying to get out, but she didn't work very much. She was very clever that way. But everybody had to work. And I remember there were 2 rabbis with us. And they wouldn't work on Sabbath for anything. And if they didn't work on Sabbath, they didn't get any food, their ration. So I remember a few, not very religious, my brother and a few young people worked for them so that
we'll take a
they
break
would
here.
get some food.
Okay, camera's rolling and set.
This is tape 3 of the interview with Hannah Nash. Hannah, we were just talking about the last few months that you were in barracks, and you were telling us that you had 2 rabbis also in that barracks with you.
Yeah.
Were they made to work?
Yes, they worked, but they wouldn't work on Sabbath. They wouldn't work if they killed them for that. They just couldn't do it. And so, you know, the younger men organized themselves to do the extra work so that they could get their food during this Sabbath days.
Was there any form of punishment in the camp?
Well, if someone didn't work or did something, they took them somewhere. We don't know where they took them. What happened to them afterwards, we never heard. They were taken from the camp. We don't know where to. But I must say that there wasn't abject cruelty. There wasn't. You know, it was very hard life. It was we were hungry all the time and cold, and it was difficult. But at least, you see, afterwards I kept comparing to the stories other people told me what happened to them. So afterwards I decided that we were lucky.
How did you keep warm? Because your clothing was limited,
Well,
wasn't it?
they gave us some clothes. They gave us felt boots, because you couldn't work in that cold, and they gave us jackets. It was called fufaika. It was like quilted. It had cotton wool in it, I don't know what, but it kept you reasonably, you know, warm. That's what was given to you. Well, they took it away when we left for someone else, but it was, otherwise you couldn't, you know, it was freezing cold.
Did you
We didn't have clothes to cope with that.
Did you have to keep the camp clean yourselves?
Oh yes, they were very particular, especially about floors. The floors had to be immaculate because most people slept on them. No, of course we had to do everything ourselves. They came for inspection, you know. And, look, no matter how clean you were, there were always some cockroaches or different vermin.
Did you have to go through a roll call each day?
Going to work, yes.
And how was your work party organised? Were there so many in the work party?
Yes, depends what job. You see, for instance, summer often we had to cut hay, you know, the grass. We had different jobs to do. Mainly it was falling trees and doing that. But they kept changing, you know, jobs for people what they did.
So,
but it was a beautiful country there. It was so beautiful, you know. I have a picture I bought. I saw a picture. I'll show you afterwards. It looks exactly like the place we were in.
Did you have wire around the camp, or was it an open camp?
It was an open camp. And look, they knew that people had nowhere to escape. The distances, the lack of language, you know. Some people picked up a few words in Russian but it wasn't enough. How could you manage? And especially in another Russia would tell that there is someone who doesn't belong to wherever they are.
What was the attitude of the guards towards you, Hannah?
Well, they did their job, but no, some of them were quite friendly, you know. If they had some extra food, like some vegetable or something, they would bring us. I remember that the commandant of the camp, he was a decent fellow. His wife had a baby. So we had a nice towel. So my mother said, oh, he's good to us. He then sent you, you know, to different job when you complained. So I'll give them the towel as a present. Oh, they were very thrilled with the towel. Next time we passed there, we saw it was hanging, like a wall hanging on the wall. They didn't use it as a towel, they used it as a, you know, like a picture you would hang on the wall. But, you know, they were not cruel people, but not the ones we were with by nature, you know. They didn't, didn't go, of course, if you didn't work, if you didn't do what they would get into trouble, they had to punish you, but I don't know, I felt that they were human.
Did they have to work too?
Yeah, well, they had different jobs. You see, that they were Russians. There were guards mainly. They were guards guarding us, and arranging the jobs we have to do. They had their jobs.
So when you were released, what happened then?
Then.
What year was that? Can you remember what year that was, Hannah?
I have it written. Wait a minute. That was the war. It was end of 41, I think. I have written on a piece of paper somewhere. Never mind. I think it was the end of 41.
So you would have been how long?
42 maybe it was. I'm not quite sure about the date. And they let us, you know, let us out of the camp, and they took us to this train.
No, what sort of train?
The same cattle train that we arrived in. But at least we were not locked in this time, you know, and we stopped at stations, we can go out, we could move, you know, and...
How did you get to the train?
Well, it was a similar way as we came, you know, we had a cart to take us to the boat, and from the boat there was a truck, you know, we got there. And then it was very difficult with the food because they didn't provide much.
Do you know roughly how many people left that camp and went down to Uzbekistan?
Oh, from our camp it would be about 200. I think about 200. But there were a lot of camps like that. You know, there were a lot of people came to Uzbekistan, tried to join the army, and a lot of people got sick there because of typhoid fever. They were getting.
So they were coming from other parts of Russia?
Yes. And there were some camps that were further north that were much harder, that they had men only, not families like us, that were much worse than our camp. But then we found out a lot that we were quite lucky. It wasn't so bad compared to other places. And then my brother then we got a bit of help from the Polish organizing the army, you know. They had a bit of gave a bit of food to people, and they organized a hospital for the typhoid, but and then we heard that the army will be evacuated to Iran.
So you took 3 weeks to get to Uzbekistan?
Yes, and then, you know, it wasn't straight away that the army was formed. We lived in a Uzbeki. It was like mud huts. It was very hard to manage. We didn't have any income. We had to provide our own food. We used to get some odd jobs if there was some jobs going, like planting, or that you would go and work all day. They would give you a bit of money and some food. Felt a bit like beggars, but we were hoped that once the army is organized, that we will be able to leave Russia. But when my brother and my cousin wanted to join the army, they didn't want to take them because they were Jewish. But fortunately we had some friends there, and somehow we managed to get out with the army to Iran.
So how did that happen, that they took you and your mother as well?
Yes. Well, we were supposed to be families of the. There was a friend of ours who was already in the army, and he said we were his family. Well, there was a lot of lying, but still we got there. and when we and the two boys, we were really afraid that they won't let them go, but they did. And as soon as we arrived in Iran, they took them to the army. They didn't want to evacuate them with the Polish army, That was the reason.
So how did you get from Uzbekistan to Iran?
By boat. It was terrible. It was dreadful. I fainted. They carried me from this boat because they packed, I don't know how many people on this small boat. And the young people, they said, had to go underneath. There was no air there at all. And they gave us ration of beef, canned beef, bully beef, and condensed milk. And everybody was sick. Can you imagine after Russia, where you hardly had anything to eat, all of a sudden people were gorging themselves on this canned fat meat and condensed milk. So on that boat, everybody with diarrhea. I can't describe what it was like.
So who provided the boat, Hannah?
Who provided the boat? Well, it was
it a
Russian boat, yes. It was Russia had this pact that they will, they needed help from England, from other countries, so they allowed the Polish army to form, and England wanted Poles to fight with them in Italy or in other places, you see.
So was your brother and your cousin actually joined the army in Uzbekistan?
No, they didn't. We sort of get out of Russia by a small miracle, but the minute we arrived in Iran, they took them to the army.
So how long was that journey on the boat?
It was only a couple of days, but it was an absolute nightmare because it was overloaded and people were sick and there was no air and it was terrible. And then we waited for a few days in the port. The port was Pahlavi was called. I'm sure it's not called that anymore because it was after the Persian Shah.
Where was this port?
It was in Iran. We went through the Black Sea, and then in Iran we got a bit of food, but everybody was sick because all of a sudden starting to eat after all those years of being so undernourished. It was terrible. But then they took us by buses to Tehran. The buses, this Iranian drivers, they were completely, they thought they were riding a horse, I think, instead driving a bus, and it was a country full of precipices. Oh, I was never so scared in my life as riding in this bus. But when we arrived in Tehran, it seemed like heaven, like you come to Paris, shops and everything. We didn't have any clothes because they burnt our clothes. It was when we left Russia, the Iran wouldn't let us in because we were in such a filthy condition. And so we had just, they gave us some coats, some long night dresses. We had no clothes whatsoever. It put us in a camp in Tehran. And I hid one dress and we had it with my mother. If one of us wanted to go anywhere, she took the dress.
So what was the place like in Tehran?
In Tehran, well, first of all, I got a job as a waitress in a restaurant. My mother got some job too, like a cashier in another restaurant. And we could speak French. That was a great help, you see, because a lot of people spoke French there. And this job, first of all, I thought, oh, it will be wonderful. I can eat what I want. There was no time to eat. It was, I worked, I think, about, I had 12-hour shift. It was really hard work in this restaurant. But I made quite a lot of money. I got myself some clothes because I got tips. No, I had a good time there. I went to improve my French. You know, it was it comes back to you when you are in a country like that, and then we were there for almost a year, and then we had a chance to go to Palestine.
What happened to your brother and
My brother was in the army. He was in Iraq. He was in. Then they went to Italy. They were fighting in Italy with the Polish army.
Your cousin as well?
Yes, they were together. I showed you a picture of the cousin. Yes. And we registered we could go to Palestine, which we were very pleased about. And but Iraq wouldn't give us visa to go to Palestine. We had to go by boat all around. I showed you how we went. We were traveling from Tehran to Palestine, which is very close. We were, for weeks, we were in Karachi in a camp for 4 weeks. And
what sort of camp was that?
it was a transit camp. I don't know, people, because something went wrong with the boat. We had to change boats, and there was not another boat. They put us in a camp. And
so were there other nationalities in the camp?
yes, that was a very mixed company in that camp.
Where were those people coming from? Do you know?
I don't know. There were a lot of Arabs there. I don't know who they were. I was hoping it won't take long. It was also, we were in tents. It was a terrible place, Karachi. And then we got another boat, and we almost, there were air raids. You know, German planes were flying over us. It was 1943. It was in the middle of the war. But we arrived in Haifa. It was a long trip. The boat wasn't too bad. It was all right.
So what was that boat? What country gave you that boat?
I think this boat, it was arranged by then Palestine, you know, to get the refugees.
So was that a Jewish organization that arranged
Yes,
that?
but the boat, they hired a boat. I don't know where from they got hired. I think there were a lot of Hindu staff. I think it was from India, this boat. Anyway, then we arrived in Haifa, and we had, my parents had some friends who went to Palestine before the war, and they somehow, I don't know how they found out, they must have looked at the list of refugees arriving, because they knew we were coming, and they came to the camp in Haifa, and they took us, they had a very nice place in Tel Aviv, and they were a great help to us. And I wanted to learn something, so the Jewish organization arranged for me to go to a course to learn English, because I thought that would be faster than learning Hebrew. And I learned to type and shorthand and things, so in 6 months. After 6 months I got a job with the British Army there. My English was pretty sketchy, but they were pleased because I could speak Polish, and there was some Poles too. They needed someone to translate it, an interpreter. Well, I was very worried about the way my English. I thought that if we lose the war, it will be my fault. But I think I mentioned to you this English major who was a teacher, and he quickly realized that I didn't know much English, and I could learn a lot, and he offered. He said, if you want, I will help you, and he prepared me to make English matriculation, and really he taught me. I am very grateful to him. He was a born teacher, and I wanted to learn. He enjoyed teaching me.
So where did you live in Haifa?
No, we lived in Tel Aviv. Our friends afterwards found us a room, and we got some help from Polish government because our brother was in the army. We are a family of soldiers, so I earned quite well in my job, and my mother got a job also packing some parcels they sent for refugees in Europe. So we managed quite well.
How long were you there for, Hannah?
Oh, we were there for 4 years. And then I met my husband, who was in Italy in the army, and he came for, holiday. They were given holidays from the army and he came and we met, and when the war ended afterwards, he came back and we got married. And he had already papers to come to Australia because he had a friend who left before the war, also a doctor, and when he found that he is alive, he sent him papers to come to Australia.
So prior to that, meeting your husband, did you and your mother feel that you would stay in Palestine?
Yes, we would. If we were not making very good living there, but still, it was still wartime, and we had nowhere to go. We wouldn't go back to Poland ever, because by then we knew what happened in Poland. And we would have stayed there, definitely. But he had, these papers for Australia, and at that time, for a doctor in Palestine wasn't they wouldn't, it was even before it was Israel, and they wouldn't register, they wouldn't let him practice there. So we decided we'll go to Australia, and we arranged. Afterwards, brought my mother and my brother, who was in England then. He was still in the army, but we brought them here.
So what year was that, Hannah?
1947.
Did you and your mother and your husband come out at the same time?
No. We came here first, and then we had to get permits for my family, because he got one for me because he married me, so we got it quickly. But I waited for a while to get for my mother and for my brother, and they came after a year after we came.
Can you remember the boat you came out on, Hannah?
Yes, this New Zealand boat, Tamaroa.
And that sailed from where?
It sailed from Suez Canal, and it was quite a long trip, but it was quite luxurious for us. We had a cabin, and we had a very good time. We stopped in India too, in Bombay we were, and that was no comparison between that trip and the others we had. Yes, and we arrived here. Well, it was difficult too, because he had to study again, and he couldn't speak any English, my husband. And he studied a year at Sydney University. It was supposed to be 3 years. I got a job straight away, because by then my English was good, and I You know, I worked in an office in Palestine. I could type, I could do shorthand. I got a job in advertising agency, and it was a very good job. I loved the job. And he still was studying. Then he found out that him being in the army that was under British command in Queensland, he could do only 1 year instead of 3. There was such a law there. So he went to Brisbane to find out, and he got enrolled and he did it 1 year. We went to Brisbane, and I don't know how he did it. I used to sit and help him study because he hardly knew any English. But he did it. With very good memory. He could remember things.
So what year was that you were in Brisbane?
Well, we arrived in 47. Then he did, in 48 he studied here. Then in 49 he did 1 year in Brisbane. So he graduated in 49.
And your mother came out the year after you did?
Yes, and she stayed in Sydney and with my brother who was studying dentistry. He got a scholarship and he studied.
And your cousin?
My cousin went to America because he found family in America, and he married a cousin's daughter, and that's another story. I don't know whether we have time for that.
We'll take a break now, Isa.
Okay. Camera's rolling and set.
This is take 4 of the interview with Hannah Nash. Hannah, you've arrived in Australia, and a year later your mother followed you.
Yes.
Where were you after your husband had completed his year at university?
We came back to Sydney. I was very lonely in Brisbane. I didn't know anybody. You know, my husband was a lot in hospital. I got a job. I worked there too in an office, but you know, my family and a lot of my friends were all in Sydney, because there was a whole group of us, you know, doctors who came from Poland and their families, and you know, we sort of kept together because we had common problems. You know, we were very lucky that he got that 1 year instead of 3, but his other friends took them longer, you know, to complete the course. And we were also lucky in that respect because no one then worried. You know, we didn't get any pension. We had to pay for the university, which Jewish community in Australia helped us to do because we didn't have that kind of money. We had a bit because my husband saved money in the army. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, so he had no expenses. And but we had more or less a you know, group of people that we kept together. We still keep who are together, the ones that are still here. So when we came back, well, my mother had a flat and my brother lived with her. He was studying. She was learning English. She learned very well English, you know, by herself. She was listening to the radio. She was a bright woman. She didn't work because she really had no qualifications for work, and her English wasn't good enough for that. But
And your mother is still alive?
my mother is alive. I don't know whether you could call it alive because she doesn't recognize anybody. She's 97 years old. And she is in Montefiore home for old people. And but She had a grandfather who lived to be 105, so unfortunately trans in our family.
Do you still work now, Hannah?
No, I don't work anymore. I worked after my, well, I worked before when he was studying. Then he settled in we settled in practice in Kempsey, that's Western side, general practice. And I had to help him a lot because, you know, we couldn't afford much other help. Well, we had a part-time receptionist because I had, shortly afterwards, I had my first son, and then a year and a half later I had second son. And we lived on top of the practice. We lived on the first floor and the surgery was downstairs, so I used to breastfeed my children downstairs the telephone all the time. I had to really help with the whole thing.
What year did you have the children, Hannah?
Martin was born in 51 and Jeffrey was born in 53.
And they have children?
They have children. Martin is a dentist. He started doing medicine, but he didn't like it, so he changed to Jeffrey is a doctor. They have, Martin has 2 daughters, which you will see, they are coming. Lucy is 13 and Jessica will be 10 next month. And Jeffrey has 2 boys, Michael, who is 10, and Jeremy, who is 7.
And what sort of activities or hobbies do you have now, Hannah?
Well, a couple of years after my husband died and boys already were finishing studies, and all of a sudden I felt that it was a bit empty, my life. I sold the house. We had a big house in Stressfield, and I bought this unit. And I was lucky enough to get a job with Tourist Commission as an interviewer. It was survey of visitors to Australia, and I did that for 14 years, 4 times a week at the Sydney airport. And I was so lucky. It was a terrific job. I loved it. I really enjoyed doing it. And well, 3 years ago, they stopped. You know, sometimes they stopped for the survey for a while. They stopped then, and then I felt that they wouldn't let me work less. I worked 4 days a week, and it was. I had grandchildren that I felt I didn't have time to spend time with. So since then, I learned to play bridge. I do other things. I go to a group of theater appreciation. I paint a little. I keep busy.
Looking back, Hannah, do you think much about the Holocaust and the effect it's had on your life?
Well, yes, I do. I do think about, not all the time, you know, but of course, and I have friends who talk more and think more about it than I did, because compared to some other people, I feel I really was very lucky that nothing worse happened to me than it did.
But how do you think you survived that sort of very harsh experience?
I think it made me a better person.
You've retained your sense of humour?
I did, yes. Yes, I heard a saying which I find is true, that life is a grind. Whether it grinds you down or polishes you up depends what you are made of.
Thank you for talking to us, Hannah.
Really?
Who's on this photograph, Hannah?
It's my maternal grandmother. The photograph would have been taken when she was about 17, and she came from a wealthy family, and she fell in love with a boy from a poor family, and her family didn't allow her to marry him, and she was underage, and she was very unhappy, and they eloped. They just ran away. And it was the happiest marriage you can imagine, you know.
Yes.
And even their wish has been granted. They have been killed together. No one was left without the other.
That was during the bombing?
During the bombing of Warsaw, in the first week of the war. And I think it's good it happened that way, because they were spared a lot of suffering afterwards.
Thank you, Hannah. Who's on this photograph, Hannah?
They are my maternal grandparents. It was in 1932, quite a while before the war, and it looks as if they were on holiday somewhere.
Where do you think it was taken? Do you know?
They used to go to a place near Warsaw called Otwock. There was a hotel there that a lot of their friends went, and the main occupation there was eating. I never seen people eating so much as they did at that place.
So it was in Poland somewhere?
It was in Poland, yes.
Thank you, Hannah. Who is this, Hannah?
That's my mother. I think this picture was taken when we first came to Palestine. That would be in 1943.
43. How old would she have been about?
About 45.
Thanks, Hannah. Who is this, Hannah?
That's my father. It was taken before the war, probably not long before the war. And my father died when he was 42 years old. 43-year-old. Yes.
Would that have been taken where?
It was taken probably in Radom before the war. I think so. You see this photograph. My mother had those photographs, a lot of them, you know. I took it from her because she doesn't need them anymore.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Can you tell us about this photograph, Hannah?
Yes, it must have been taken just before the war, judging the way we looked, myself and my brother. And it is my grandparents, my parents, and us, and it looks again like Otwock in winter. And it is, I can remember it being taken.
Are your parents in the middle? Or your grandparents?
My on one side is from left to right, it's my father, my mother, my grandfather, and my grandmother. And standing up is my brother, myself and my brother.
Thank you, Hannah. Can you tell us about this photograph,
Yes,
Hannah?
that photograph was taken in England. It was after the war, and Henry, my cousin, he had a romance by correspondence with a relative in America, and they were expecting her to arrive in London, and both of them came to meet them. They were getting married, Henry and the girl, and when she arrived, she thought my brother was the future husband, and he said he never felt so embarrassed in his life. And as you can see, my brother is better looking.
So which side is your brother on,
The
Hannah?
left-hand side,
And
Henry
Henry.
on the right-hand side. Poor Henry.
What year was that? Do you remember?
Well, it was the end, about 45, 46.
Thanks, Hannah.
Yes, this picture was taken in Poland about 5, 6 years before he died. He met a friend of his sister who died in the war as well.
Who is it, Hannah?
That's my husband. and she took this picture, and I thought it's my favorite because I think it's excellent picture of him.
What was your husband's Christian name?
Adek.
Thanks, Hannah.
Yes, this picture looks well worn because it was taken when we arrived in Palestine, and my mother sent this picture to my brother who was then in Italy, and he kept it in his pocket all the war. That's why it is so worn out. I took it from my mother's collection.
So it's yourself and your mother.
Yes.
You're on the left.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes,
Your mother's
I'm
on the
on
right.
the left,
Mhm.
my mother's on the right.
So where was it taken in?
In Palestine,
Palestine.
when we arrived, it was in 43,
Thank
a
you,
long
Hannah.
time ago. Yes, that picture was taken just when we arrived in Australia.
Of yourself?
Pardon?
Of yourself?
Of myself, yes. Starting a new life.
What year was that, Hannah?
47? It was 1947 we arrived in Australia.
Thank you, Hannah.
That is a picture of my brother, Michael, who was a keen skier. I don't think he does it anymore, but he's still pretty fit.
What year was that, Hannah?
A couple of years ago, it would have been 93 or 4.
Taken, where was that taken?
Well, he went skiing, Kosciuszko, I think it was.
Thanks, Hannah.
And that's a recent picture of my mother about a year ago. She's then still recognized me and Michael, but she doesn't anymore.
Where was that taken? At the nursing home, was it?
Yes, it was. Michael took this picture.
And she was 90?
Oh, so she was always pretty vague about her age. Couldn't pin her down.
Thanks, Hannah.
Now, that was taken at, I think, Jewish New Year. We had a dinner here, and it's quite recent, a few months ago. And I think Jeffrey took this picture, and it is my favorite.
Who is it, Hannah?
It is myself, Lucy, Jessie, Mikey, and Jeremy. My 4 grandchildren.
Which side is Lucy?
Lucy is on the right-hand side. She is the eldest, and Jessie is on the left next to me. Then is the youngest, Jeremy, and on the right side is Mike.
Thank you, Hannah.
Camera's rolling and set.
Hannah, you're here with your lovely family. Perhaps you'd like to start by introducing everybody.
Yes. On my right side is my daughter-in-law, Pat. On my left side is my younger son, Jeffrey. And next to him is his younger son, Jeremy, sitting on the lap of his mommy, Vicky. Next to it is Jessica, Mikey, and the oldest, Lucy.
Thanks, Hannah. And would anybody like to just say a few words to the camera about Hannah?
We're thrilled that Mum's had the opportunity to tell the story because we're proud of her, and we think we'd like the children and future generations to know that you can go through the experience she went through and still survive and lead a happy life, but that we never forget it.
Anybody else like to say a few words? Vicky?
Well, she's a wonderful woman, and I mean, she's a wonderful mother-in-law, and we've been very close. But the Holocaust is something that she's always found very difficult to talk about, even so many years on. And I think it's just so important that it's all remembered.
And Pat, would you like to say anything?
Yes, well, I met Hanka 18 years ago, And
That long.
unfortunately, yes.
Pat, you're married to
To Martin.
Martin.
Yes, Martin couldn't be here
Hannah's other son.
today,
Mhm.
unfortunately. And she's been a wonderful mother-in-law, wonderful grandma. She's taken me into her family, and I came from a very different background to hers. I'm not Jewish, but I admire her for everything really, for her past and for her present. She's a wonderful woman. I love her dearly.
Thank you, Pat. And how about the children?
Best
do you
reference I
realise
could
one
get.
of her children? Yes? Michael?
I think she's a great grandma. She's always very nice to me, and
Helped you with your homework, does she?
well, she did once when she was and I love her.
Lucy?
Oh,
That's a few words?
well, she's just great in every way. You know, she's generous and really nice.
And Jessica?
Well, she's very generous, and I love staying here with her, and I just love her. Oh, and I love her soup, yeah.
And Jeremy?
Oh, I'm saying tall.
Hello.
Hello?
And you love it.
I love the soup too.
Jeremy's very shy.
What do you think of grandmother making the tape, children? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think it's very good that she's telling about everything, about the Holocaust and everything, and nothing else really.
Hannah, what's important to you now?
What do you mean? Important
In your life?
in my
Yes,
life.
yes, yes.
It's important to watch my grandchildren grow, to be wonderful people, to see my children happy and successful. I think that is the greatest happiness a mother can have. I'm very proud of my family. I think they are terrific support to me, and they admire, the whole family relates to each other. I think I am a very lucky woman.
Thank you very much, and thank you, family.